We're on this affair between Amulek and Alma, and it's a very important one. If I can get things straight here. In the second chapter of Alma. Now, who's fighting who here? Things had been going very bad with the church because of Nehor. Nehor had taken all the people away, and they all thought they were the true church. Nehor did too, and Alma did too. And a man by the name of Amaleki thought he could cash in on the Nehor movement. He wanted to go all the way, become extreme right-wing, and make himself king. So we have two factions facing each other. And here you don't have Nephites versus Lamanites at all, because they're both Nephites on both sides. And Amalekites and everything mixed up. And soon, already, Amaleki has planned to join up with the Lamanites. As far as Nephi is concerned, it's not the good people and the bad people. It's not the church against the opponents of the church. They're both following Alma here. Most of them didn't want to go as far right as Amaleki meant. So some of the church, all the church, and most of the other people stuck with Alma. So we have a very mixed thing. This is a typical Latin America, Central America mix-up of things. Some guy wants to make himself power, and he's a general, and he wants to be the whole thing, you see. And so we're on familiar grounds here. All these wars take place on that scale amid great confusion. Who's on which side? They're going to start. Some people are going to start running away. Some people are going to start changing sides. And so it's not Nephites versus Lamanites, and it's not believers versus pagans. They're believers on both sides. You see, Amaleki got a lot of Nehor's people. He was Nehor himself, and they said we're the true church. And on the other hand, Alma, most of the people that followed Alma didn't belong to his church, didn't want his church, and so it goes this way. Typical affair. And it certainly wasn't the good guys versus the bad guys, as we'll find out. You think it would be at least that, but no, it isn't. And so we have here, don't try to put a situation map on the board. It would be useless here. It's quite a complicated affair militarily, and a very interesting one too. Amaleki is a very shrewd strategician. He knows how to do it. He sets up on a hill, of course. Well, it seems to be a fortified hill. It's referred to at other times, and it's on the shore apparently of the river, which makes it impossible to surround him. That would give him one advantage at least. It's on the hill which is east of the riverside, and the river, which is the river which bounds the land, as a matter of fact. And here we go. He's on the river to avoid probably being surrounded here. Where's what we have a note here? Yes. He's trying to total takeover of power. And we get the east and west is very confusing. The war is fought on both sides of the river. We don't need to worry about these particulars, but it's an interesting one if you try to analyze what they're doing here. War is fought on the east side of the river Sidon. They began to make war with the Nephites. They took that as their post. That's where they raised their banner, and they invited combat there, you see. Remember, ancient war was formalized and ritualized, and notice there they began to make war with the Nephites. They chose the time and the place of the war, and it was on a hill, a strong point on the river, and this was the river that didn't divide the land, it says, but which ran by the land of Zarahemla. It's more like a boundary, you see. It ran by the land. How near they're committed to that, or at a small distance. Well, then Alma went up with his people, with his captains at the head of his army. Notice his threefold function. He's chief judge. Again, he is head of the army now, and he's chief of the church. He's everything. He could easily become a dictator, you see, and which is exactly what Amaleki wanted to do. He wanted to make himself king. And they began to slay Amalekites on the hill east of Sidon. So the hill is on the east side of the river, and they attacked the base there. And the Amalekites began to flee, and the Nephites pursued them that day and slew them with much slaughter. So these are royalist Nehors versus a mixed group of Nephites here, and the political conflict is nastier than the war with their brethren, the Lamanites. Notice the Nephite wars are always the dirtiest. They don't have much trouble with the Lamanites, actually. Well, they mix them up. Well, it came to pass that Alma, where the 20th verse in the second chapter, he could pursue the Amalekites no longer. He caused that he should pitch his tent in the valley of Gideon. Well, we could put a valley of Gideon there. That was going to be their base camp. And here's a reminder of the original trouble. It all goes back to Gideon, who slew the same Nehor by the sword. So these things are all related. We go back to Nehor country again, where the camp of Gideon against Nehor. Now it was their camp against Amalekite. These places apparently have strategic value, and he sent spies to know the plots of the others, and the plot was a clever one. He'd had an agreement with the Lamanites to get their support. You can see that, and a chance for the Lamanites to get some support, a chance for the Nephites too, to Amalekite too, to win the battle. And so they watched the camp of the Amalekites, so the Amalekites watched their camp. In the foul womb of night, as Shakespeare says, the two camps were watching each other. And the camps were very close together, too. On the morrow, they returned to the camp. They were greatly astonished to find that the Amalekites had made contact with the Lamanites. A complete surprise. Above the land of Zarahemla, they've gone above the land again. Where is that? Apparently to the north, land of Zarahemla, because when they fall back, it's always going to be toward the north then. That's where the supplies are coming from. That's where their strength is, the north and the west. And behold, the Amalekites have joined them. So this was a planned operation, as we read in 2:15 here. Upon the hill east by the river Sidon and so forth, he took up that position with a contact with the Lamanites in mind all the time, perhaps to fall back on it, drawing the Nephites away from Zarahemla. It's a very, very shrewd action, you see. That's why the hill Amnihu was not in the central position, you see. We're told in the 27th verse it was the hill on the Lamanite side of the river. So it was a good thing, but there were Nephites living on both sides. And so it goes on here. And then they discovered not only that the Amalekites had joined up with the Nephites, but the people settled. You see, these were just armies fighting here now. And you may have heard the lecture on the French Revolution the other day, how from the French Revolution, the first time you find the people in arms, the people just stood by and watched wars being fought before, you see. And moreover, they didn't have uniforms before. They didn't have the type of militarism before at all. The Nephites were still living in the land and cultivating it there. Now they started to run away. Some very funny things happened there. I remember going out with a person called Smith. He was a professional prize fighter, and he was General Max Taylor's aide. Max Taylor wanted something fresh, some salad, and Smith had spotted a place where there was some lettuce growing near a farmhouse. It was all deserted, so we went out to get the lettuce by the farmhouse. It was on the German side of the line, and the other was up toward Arnhem, and we crossed this canal, and there we have it. There was the lettuce, sure enough. But as soon as we started to get the lettuce, then they started dropping whatchamacallums, not bazookas, boy, far gone today. No, they started shooting, not with shells, but with, what do you do when you shoot short up, close up? Well, anyway, they started lobbing these grenades in, and we just hide behind the house. And then, incidentally, how wild things got all of a sudden. The house was completely overgrown, inside and outside, though the people had only been away for a couple of weeks. It's a wet country, you know, with vines all inside. And there were sheep running around. The sheep were wild. They were fierce, amazing. We could have got some good mutton there. But the mortars, they started shooting mortar shots, small size mortars. There was an embankment and a canal, and a canal over here. And on this green canal, there were a dozen little Dutch boys playing soldier. And all this banging was going on, and these boys continued to play soldier and paid no attention to us whatever. They were having their game. They weren't interested in our game in the least, you see. See, the civilians go their own way. They don't get involved in these things until we involve them in war now and deliberately do all the sorts of things we do. But it was so interesting to see those little kids. They weren't interested in what we were doing. They had the real thing over there. The imagination is more important. And that happens quite a number of occasions like that. Some little Polish kids having a picnic. Some little Polish kids having a picnic, and all this shooting was going on around them. They were right in between, but these were the nicest trees, they said, so they'd have their picnic. All these little Polish kids, they just marched like Boy Scouts. They're marvelous kids. They had such spirit, and they were led by a little girl, and they were very neatly dressed and so forth, very proper. They were practically slaves. This was in Nazi Germany, you know, and here they were walking out, marching out to have their picnic, and she was telling them, watch and step, be proud, don't make them ashamed of you. These strange things. Well, it's the same way here. The people began to run toward the city. Another race toward the city, and the people of Nephi departed out of Gideon, which was their camp. They left there, and they made a race for Zarahemla too. That's where the army was. So both the army and the civilians, everybody's making toward Zarahemla to get there before Amlicites gets it. And they had to cross the river Sidon to get there, and this was on the border, we're told, and this was the trap. And it was there, the sands of the sea, they came upon them to destroy them. They were waiting for them at the forge. These rivers could forge. It's very clear that the Sidon could be forged here. And they came upon them to destroy them. And Alma fought with Amlicites on the sword face to face. Now here you have a good case of Star Wars, the good guy versus the bad guy. Always, only such. See, the wicked destroy the wicked. And we see this reflecting on this one. If we go to 4, 2, and 3 here, after this war, if you think these people were the good guys, it said and the people were afflicted, yea, greatly afflicted for the loss of their brethren, and also for the loss of their flocks and their herds, and for the loss of their fields of grain, and which were trodden underfoot and destroyed by the Lamanites, did them no good. And so great were their afflictions that every soul had cause to mourn, and they believed that it was the judgment of God sent upon them because of their wickedness. Therefore they were awakened to remembrance of their duty, and that was the promise given to Nephi, that the Lord would always have the Lamanites breathing down their neck to stir them up to remembrance. And this is another case where it happened. When they were wicked, that's what brought on the war. As Mormon tells us later on, behold, don't worry about the wicked, he says. Behold, the judgment of God will surely overtake the wicked, and it's by the wicked that the wicked are punished. They're going to be punished, but make sure it isn't by you, that you're not doing the punishing. Well, then he slew Amlicites with a sword, and he also contended the king of the Lamanites and his guards. And then there's more business. Notice here, they cleared the ground. They have to get over to the west bank for the big fighting, though. They had to clear the ground on the west bank, and they might have room to cross and contend with the Lamanites and Amlicites on the west side. So a strong force is waiting for them on the west side of the river. When they'd all crossed the river, the Lamanites and the Amlicites began to flee before them, so they didn't have the engagement after all, when they'd all got across. And they fled before them, and they fled north and west beyond the borders, right way up there. And in fact, it went so far, it went to Hermounts. Now this word Hermounts is really an interesting one. 37. They were slain and driven and were scattered on the west and the north until they reached the wilderness, which is called Hermounts, and it was part of the wilderness which was infested by wild and ravenous beasts. Now where does the word Hermounts come from? I'm going to have to write this one on the board. We can take off our hat now. I think there are ladies present. Hermounts. Now this is certainly not a Latin word. It's not a Greek word. It's not a Hebrew word. It's not a Semitic word. Hermounts. And where was it? It was a land on the borders that was infested at times by wild beasts at certain seasons of the year. So it's way up in the borders. They're going way up there, you see. So what it is the Egyptian Hermounts, obviously. Monthus. In Egypt, Monthus, Month, was the Egyptian Pan. He was the god of wild places. He was the god of wild animals in the wild country, Monthus. And Hermonthus was the southernmost part of Egypt, was the outmost part of Egypt, where the land was sometimes visited by lions and crocodiles and things like that. It was under cultivation, but it was the place that was in danger from animals, and they called it Hermonthus because it was Month's country, wild animal country, you see. They say Month is the Egyptian Pan. So we have this here means under the rule of Month. Month is the beneficent lord of wild animals, the animals. And Hermonthus was that ground in Egypt, which was the part far removed, and yet was visited by animals. And they called this part Hermounts. No other word could match it so perfectly, because it was infested at times by wild beasts. Now, if there was a coincidence, and that is the most unimaginable, most fantastic word in the Book of Mormon, because it has no philological connection, you see, until you recognize Hermonthus. And so we go on. Then finally, there we have a shattered host then. They really are shattered, and they begin to run. And this is an interesting thing, you see. Amlicites people could go home, and they did. But it was only on agreement, on convenience with the Lamanites, who didn't want them there. I mean they could not go home, and they did not. Amlicites say, where were they to go? Everybody fled toward the north, toward the far west, as far as they could get, way up there to Hermonthus, it says, and amongst the beasts. But the poor Amlicites dead now. Naturally, you'd think the Lamanites would welcome their in. They had had this agreement with them, not a bit of it. The Lamanites say, we don't owe you a thing. Many died in the wilderness of their wounds and were devoured by those beasts and also the vultures of the air. Their bones have been found and have been heaped upon the earth. They could not go home, you see now. It was only an agreement of convenience with the Lamanites. The Lamanites didn't feel any responsibility for them. They just let them hanging in the wind. The Amalekites had nowhere to go, went up the northward and were not able to survive there, and so they were destroyed. And now we come to speaking, we've been speaking a lot of ethnology here, and now we come to perhaps the most important ethnic chapter in the book. I must get this book of, what's his names for this? A person by the name of Fillmore S.C. Northrop has written a book, a recent one on East and West, an anthropology book here, which I'm going to read in a minute. Now here we are. They returned to their lands and returned to their houses and their wives and their children, all back to where we started. And it was a sad affair. Many women and children had been slain with the sword, many of their flocks and herds, and also many of their fields of grain. This is the perennial tragedy of Latin America, isn't it? These sad pictures. And the greatness of their number, and not the number of the slain were not numbered because of the greatness of their number. After they'd finished burning, they all returned to their lands and to their houses and their wives and their children. And then it says, nothing was gained by this political brawl. That's what it was, you see. Flocks and herds had been lost, and also many of their fields and grain were destroyed, for they were trodden down by the hosts of men. They were in the depths of the sea. Now this is interesting too, notice, and cast into the waters of Sidon, and behold, their bones are in the depths of the sea. That was near the mouth of the river Sidon. It would be very unsanitary just to throw their bodies in the river, but it said they were swept out to sea. So it'd be quite close. Remember, it's a narrow neck of land here. It puts us into some sort of scale, anyway, that they were swept out to sea. It shows that the river Sidon was not only fordable, but it emptied into the ocean not far away. And this third verse. And the Amalekites, now they'd marked themselves. Now here we get the ethnic mark. What makes a race here? Well, they decide to be Lamanites. They identify with Lamanites, and this happens again and again. And they marked themselves with red in their foreheads after the manner of the Lamanites. And nevertheless, they had not shorn their heads like the Lamanites, so they're being different degrees now. They look like Lamanites because of that mark. Now the heads of the Lamanites were shorn, and they were naked, save it were the skin which is girdled about their loins. Well, now, people that went around like that all the time would certainly have darker skins than people who didn't. It's the same thing, you see. This makes the blackness. Notice he's going to tell us in this chapter, the Lamanites put the marks on themselves. They marked themselves, not knowing that they were fulfilling the promise of the Lord that He would mark them. A way of life produces this darkening of the skin. Of course, it's the same way all over the world. You see, you have the Beit Sha'ar and the Beit Hadar. The people that live in the stone houses have white complexions, and the people who live in the tents, in the houses of hair, of goat's hair, they have dark complexions. That always distinguished among the Arabs, the people in the houses, the same people, the same blood, but there's a great deal of difference between them. They're much, much lighter. And it's the same thing if you'll notice in Greek face paintings. Of course, the women are always painted with white faces because they're in house all the time. Also use white lead, that would help. And the men are always painted bronze, quite bronze, especially in those marvelous paintings from the island. I was thinking those from it's from Crete, but no, I'm thinking from the has two names, Sarta, and the other one is well, the Commanders. They're various islands, but they show these things very clearly. The dark and the light, and the Egyptians the same way too. I mean, Egyptians the very same way. You see, the women are always painted a pale, very pale color, and the men are always a dark brown. It's a matter of living outdoors and so forth. Well, this would account for one part of the island of Santorini, of course, the ancient island of Thera, the one that blew up. But there we find these marvelous paintings from 1600 BC, and they're gorgeous paintings. But always the men are dark, the women are white. where you find two different races and people and so forth. And so the same thing here, that they'd mark themselves and went around naked, and so they're going to get that way. And you find your way. If you go down and live with those people, you get that way. You very soon get that desert varnish on your face, and you learn to walk with the drag of your feet because you're walking in the sand, and you don't try to walk straight, because why should you when you're slugging through the sand and so forth? You get to look and feel just like a Hopi there in Indians. The skins of the Lamanites were dark, according to the mark which was set on them by their fathers, which is a curse upon them because of their transgression. Well, who set it on them? The fathers set it on them. It's going to be a way of life of culture. Where do racial characters come from in the first place? They come from environment, don't they? Everybody agrees on that. Adaptation, segregation. People in the north want to get all the sun they can, so I have no pigmentation at all. If I lived in the south, I'd have to be protected from the sun, so I'd be dark. This is the way it goes.
But it was their fathers who placed the curse upon
their
them.
way of life, yes.
Due to the way of life that they chose.
Also, the things, yes, they chose it, and they remember they took to this way of life by their own free will. And it was, notice, and this adaptation is very fast. This is the most interesting thing. I guess I better put Herdlischke's name on the board. You all know about Herdlischke. Well, it's taught by certain things, races formed by adaptation to certain climatic conditions and so forth, and then it's by separation. When groups separate, they go off in different distances and get different from each other, but in doing so they also join up with others. So then you get segregation and you get process of joining again, which is exactly what you had at Babel, the so-called Tower of Babel. At Babel, that was a place where people scattered in all directions, and the languages were scattered, and also people came together from all directions, and new languages are formed. Whenever you bring people together, different people together, you get a new language. Whenever you separate one people, you get two languages. The dialects will start up just like that. So here, again, the man who talked about the French Revolution, you said, remember, that until the French Revolution, France they didn't speak French, they spoke all sorts of things. Dialects. They were dialects. They melted into French, so forth and so on. But as soon as people separate, they get their dialects. They get different languages. Then came the Revolution, and they started a regular system of education, and within a generation, they all began speaking the same French. The same things happen in the Book of Mormon. You know that, where the people Mosiah teaches the people Nephite, and it makes them much more efficient in their business and so forth. But bilingual people are very common. I mean, you're hearing much Spanish spoken around here now. When I came here, you never would hear anybody speaking Spanish, let alone an Oriental language. That was absolutely out of the question. Now you hear it all the time. Things do change, and they change rapidly. And Herdlischke is a good example. I write name Herdlischke because the way of spelling it. Alice Herdlischke. As he's a Yugoslav, a Croatian. Alice Herdlischke. Now, he came over here, and he was an anthropologist, and became the most famous anthropologist of his time. He came over from Yugoslavia. He spent millions, an enormous project, trying to prove the Alaska Bridge, that the Indians came over the Bering Strait and so forth, and never was able to prove it because they didn't have the kind of evidence they do today. It's still a different story today. Nothing's been settled up there. But he was interested in immigration, and he started making checks on immigrants coming. He settled in New York first, and then went to Harvard, and he started checking immigrants and the children of immigrants here to see how they differed in bodily build, complexion, and everything from their parents. And he found within the first generation, he went through thousands of cases. It became a very celebrated work. I mean, he became the daddy of American anthropology here. And he discovered that in the first generation, no matter which country people came from, well, he specialized mostly in Mediterranean, dark Mediterranean and Eastern people. All their children were noticeably taller, all their children were noticeably blonder, all their children had noticeably larger chest measurements, all their children had noticeably longer legs and so forth. In one generation they started changing, notably. The Israelis found that. I mean, there's volumes in Israeli, these shorts where the Eastern European Jews would go to Israel and have tall blonde children. Everybody was just electrified. How come? We changed so suddenly like that. It's an amazing thing that happened. You find all sorts of articles on that. But these changes by segregation and joined together and so forth, but merely moving over into another environment, how could that work? Well, nobody knows, but statistically it did work on a massive scale, and Herdlischke's work was very convincing. It made him very famous. And But here we go on. And their brethren sought to destroy them, therefore they were cursed, and the Lord sought to set a mark on them. Yea, Laman and Lemuel, and also the son of Ishmael, and the Ishmaelitish women. They were also dark, you notice. Was it because they intermarried? Remember, we're told that Laman and Lemuel intermarried with sons and daughters of Ishmael. Well, they all did for that matter. But remember, these Ishmaelites here now, they're Arabs of the desert, but after all, Lehi is of Manasseh. He's just as much a desert as they are, and they all get mixed up here. And this was done, their seed might distinguish from the seed of their brethren, that they thereby God might preserve his people, that they might not mix and believe in incorrect traditions. Notice tradition has the priority here. And here again, things that God does but men may not do here. He may give life, men may not. He may take life, men may not, we're told in Ether 8 and 19. He may judge, men may not judge. God may smite, men may not smite. God says, Mormon says, man shall not smite, neither shall he judge, or shall not judge, neither shall he smite. Well, there are all sorts of things that God does, but he segregates them here, and he segregates them in his own way. He has this way of doing it. But notice the tradition has priority. He doesn't want them to mingle with incorrect traditions, so he puts a slight mark on them to keep them apart, to distinguish them, and yet they're going to be joining together all the time here. Then, this is what happens. Whosoever did mingle his seed, that is, his people, one people with another, with that of the Lamanites, did bring the same curse on him, share the same culture as that. They were not just Nephites. Remember, it came to pass that whosoever mingled his seed with that of the Lamanites. Not just Nephites, but anybody who did. Because remember, there were more Amalekites than Lamanites there. But anybody who mixed with a Lamanite did bring the same curse upon his seed. And you call the curse the culture. Depends on how you want it. Therefore, he suffered himself, if you suffered yourself to be led away by the Lamanites, marriage is not enough, you see. You have to share their culture. It's not a physical thing. You have to be led away by them and join in their way of life, their culture. Was called under that head. He was called by that name, therefore, and there was a mark set upon him. And you set it on yourself, actually. Came to pass that whosoever would not believe in the tradition of the Lamanites, notice it's the traditions that we're separating here, not the blood, not the people, tradition of the Lamanites, but believed on those records which were brought out of the land of Jerusalem, they were called Nephites. No matter what your family was or anything else, you were called a Nephite. A Nephite or a Lamanite was one who accepted a tradition, the Nephite or the Lamanite tradition. This 11th verse makes that very clear. And if you have not accepted the scenario, it is they who have kept the records which are true, and also of the people, true of the people of the Lamanites. Now they start marking themselves here in this verse here, in the 13th verse. It's the Amlicites. They had set a mark upon them, yea, they set a mark upon themselves, a mark of red upon their foreheads. Notice the Amalekites were Nephites who joined the Lamanites, and they set a mark upon their foreheads in imitation of the Lamanites. They wanted to be Lamanites here. Thus, the word of God was fulfilled, for he said, for these are the words of Lamanites, behold, the Lamanites have I cursed, and I will set a mark on them. Well, they were putting the mark on, and this fulfills the prophecy that the Lord said, I will set the mark. When they did it themselves, then they fulfilled the prophecy. Here, this statement by, he's a Yale professor in anthropology. I don't have too much trust in Yale anthropologists. I've run into some of them. Or Chicago anthropologists. I shared an office for 4 years with one of them. He was the head of the American Society of Archaeologists. Morris Opler. Oh, we had a lot of times together. He was an Indian man. And let me tell you some stories about him someday. But now, this is what C. Fillmore N.C. Northrop of Yale writes in his book, The Meeting of East and West. With the effects of 18th century impigmentation on cosmological, highly formalized Christian dogma of European Spanish invasion upon the people of Mexico at the midpoint of North and South America in Central American continents, to which vast numbers of humans already had come from Asia across the Pacific and from the Pacific Islands during untold numbers of earlier millenniums. See, there's no reason in the Book of Mormon why there shouldn't be more than one migration. These Pacific Basin people, whom the Spanish invaders found in Mexico, showed a crossbred physiognomy embracing every physical feature and skin color known anywhere around the earth. They're all there. They were so crossbred that they could no longer be spontaneously differentiated into separate color races. This crossbreeding was advanced in both